Hello and welcome to the National Hispanic Cannabis Council and Doctors for Cannabis Regulations inaugural Educational Committee Forum on Cannabis 101, where we bring medical professionals together to demystify the health and wellness power of cannabis to break down the Latino community's long-held cultural taboos and beliefs on cannabis. My name is David Sanchez. I'm a founding board member of the National Hispanic Cannabis Council and Cresco Labs' very own VP of Product Development. Today, we bring together three doctors on the front lines of the battle against opioids by prescribing medicinal cannabis. They are Dr. Peter Grinspoon from Doctors for Cannabis Regulation and my partners from the NHCC's Board of Directors, Dr. Phil Burns and Dr. Craig Ontel from New York State of Mind. Before I introduce our panel for today, I want to say a couple of words on the NHCC's mission, which is to demystify the health and wellness of cannabis to the Hispanic community. And we do this by bringing these educational forums such as Cannabis 101 and bring the medical professionals together to help educate, talk to our patients, talk to our viewers, and really give them the education that they want and need to help create that awareness, which we all know cannabis has lived alongside humans for thousands of years and has been cultivated for medicinal purposes for just as long. So joining us today, guys, we have Dr. Peter Grinspoon, who is an MD, primary care physician and cannabis specialist at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Peter Grinspoon is an instructor at Harvard Medical School and a certified health and wellness coach. Dr. Grinspoon is a contributing editor to Harvard Health publications, as well as a TEDx speaker. He is author of the forthcoming book, Seeing Through the Smoke, a cannabis specialist untangles the truth about marijuana. This is to be released in April 2023, as well as the groundbreaking memoir, Free Refills. A doctor confronts his addictions. Dr. Grinspoon is a board member of the advocacy group Doctors for Cannabis Regulations. He is a popular speaker internationally on the topics of cannabis, psychedelics, addiction, opioids, and physician health. He is regularly featured in the national and international press. Dr. Peter Grinspoon, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. For our next speaker, Dr. Craig Ontel. Dr. Ontel trained at the NYU's Rusk Institute of Rehabilitation. From there, Dr. Ontel has spent nearly 15 years of private practice in NYC. Dr. Ontel has also served as a director of ambulatory orthopedic rehabilitation at NYU Langone's hospital system. In May of 2021, he left NYU to become the CEO for the State of Mind Cannabis. Dr. Ontel has personally treated hundreds of medical cannabis patients over the past few years and has had significant success in weaning patients off of narcotic-based medicines and substituting with non-euphoric, non-sedating cannabis-based options. Dr. Ontel has been published in numerous cannabis articles and has presented at national conferences. Dr. Ontel, welcome.
Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me today, David.
Of course, of course. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Phil Burns, doctor of osteopathic medicine, has been practicing medicine for over 20 years, completing specialty training in the field of physical medicine and rehabilitation at NYU Langone's Health Rusk Institute of Rehabilitation Medicine. Upon completion of this specialty training, he founded and has operated a successful medical practice specializing in orthopedic rehabilitation and prosthetics. Dr. Burns is driven by his desire to make a meaningful impact in the state's opioid crisis. Dr. Burns, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. And today's NHCC's Educational Committee Roundtable on Cannabis 101, our intent for today's session is to provide an informative overview of cannabis and opioids. So, good agenda for today's conversation. But before we dive into our conversation for today, I wanted to ask about the mission for DFCR. Dr. Peter Grinspoon, can you tell us about the mission?
Absolutely. Our advocacy group, Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, isn't just made out of doctors. We have doctors, lawyers, nurses, and it's a national organization where we focus on, number one, legalization, because, it's really amazing how in some parts of this country it's legal and you can make a living selling it. In other parts of the country, you can get thrown in prison for 5 years for selling the same cannabis. So we're working on legalization with sensible regulations. We don't want it to be a complete free-for-all. And we're very interested in social justice and equity expungements. And finally, we put a great deal of effort into educating physicians. Physicians are not taught about cannabis in medical school. To the extent that they are, what they're taught isn't actually true. And they're not taught about the endocannabinoid system, which is the system of neurotransmitters and molecules in our brains that make the whole thing work. So we spend a lot of time trying to educate physicians. Physicians are very hungry for good education about cannabis at this point.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Grinspoon. Let's dive right in. So, Craig, I think you're on mute there.
I have to switch out internet providers. Give me 1 sec.
Sure.
Yeah, when I was trying to log on, it said Zoom needs to update. I was like, what is that?
Classic.
Why do they do it after your meeting? Why do they do it when you're like trying to get it
Right before?
So,
1 sec. Let me just swap this out to a different provider.
All good. Dr. Burns, I got to ask you, what product do you use? That hair is always tip-top shape.
Just showered minutes ago.
Take it off, dude. It's a piece. Come
Yeah. I'll look like an unmade bed in 10 minutes.
on.
Always looking good.
Yeah. Not only that, but when it's wet, it looks less gray. That's why he's doing it.
Oh, I see.
You're
I
younger
see.
than us. Peter knows the deal. It looks less gray.
no, absolutely. Well, I'm here working on my Jufro as we speak. So
Yeah.
with the humidity.
You should have seen my Jufro during the pandemic. I'm going to send you a picture. I had hair that was 3 feet tall. All curls. It was awesome. All right. Sorry about that, guys. Okay.
We're good to go?
Yep.
All right. I'm going to reset it here for us. All right. So now for our discussion, let's dive right in. To kick off our discussion, let's start with a working understanding of what are opioids?
Opioids are painkillers that work on a certain type of receptor in our brain, the opioid receptors. People, have used opiates for more than 100 years with very successful treatment of pain. They're a really important medication. Unfortunately, they're also quite addictive. So people are getting addicted to them, not just for medical reasons, but, there have been a lot of them hanging around the medicine closets because doctors prescribe them. It's a long story, but doctors overprescribe them. And now a lot of people are addicted to them, and a lot of people are on them for chronic pain, even though there's not any good evidence that they're helpful for chronic pain. So I suspect that's going to feed into our discussion. Once you're on opiates, you feel awful. If you come off opiates, then you take them again and you feel better. So it feels like you're helping your chronic pain, but there just isn't very good evidence. And one of my contentions is that for mild to moderate pain, cannabis is just as effective and much less toxic. I think if someone has extremely severe pain, or acute pain like a broken bone, they probably need opiates. But for a lot of people who are on opiates, they should certainly be offered the option of cannabis.
So with that working definition, what are the major differences between cannabis and opioids?
Should I jump in, or do you guys want to jump in, or how do you want to?
You can jump in. You could finish that one and then we'll hop on. Don't worry.
Yeah.
The major difference? Well, they work on different but overlapping receptors. They're cannabinoid receptors for cannabis that were discovered, 3 or 4 decades ago. And the plant cannabis, which has been around for millions of years, sort of hijacks our machinery, and that's how people are able to use it for anxiety, insomnia, sleep, chronic pain. So it's just a different drug that works on a different receptor. But interestingly, there's overlap between the cannabis and the opiate actions. So, which is important as will come out a little bit later, because you could use much lower dose of opiates if you also use medical cannabis. And most of the trouble you get into with opiates is dose related. So that can be very helpful.
Yeah, David, and I think, one of the real big differences between the two is really the effect on the brainstem. And with regards to the brainstem, what we worry about, the brainstem controls respiration, it controls some of the cognition. It also interplays with motor function. And the opioids affect the brainstem where the cannabinoids do not. So our risk profile on the physician end is less overall. And I'll just give you a brief example. When we write an opioid prescription, we know that's a respiratory depressant. And we have a very big concern about commingling that product with other things such as alcohol. And unfortunately, folks have heard the story about someone relatively healthy going to bed at night who's using opioids who doesn't wake up in the morning. And that's because of sometimes either too much opioids or the addition of other products that add to that respiratory depression. So we're not seeing that in cannabinoids-based treatment at all. Additionally, like Dr. Grinspoon just mentioned, the data and a lot of the literature out there does show that if we're able to add some cannabinoid product to patients who are on this long-term opioid use, they're using less of their prescribed opioid products. And when we talk about brainstem and motor function, that's our population that gets up at night and goes to bed and has to go to the bathroom. And I'm sure a lot of folks that are going to be watching this check that box off, where they're at that age where they're getting up, 2, 3 in the morning to use the restroom. When they're on their opioid-based products that are affecting that brainstem, when they get up at night, they're all over the place, and there's a high risk of falls and concurrent injuries. We're not seeing that when we're managing sleep and pain with opioid-based products. So the safety profile on that level from an anecdotal base is much greater.
If I could just add on, the reason that works like that is because there just aren't cannabinoid receptors on the brainstem, which controls our breathing center. Very tragically, we've had more than 100,000 people overdose and die on opiates within the last 12 months, more than we've ever had. And that's exactly as Craig said, this from the effect of the opiates on the brainstem, which just stops we don't think about breathing, it happens automatically, but it's actually an intricate process is controlled by the brain. And if you take too many opiates, you stop breathing, and you literally can't overdose on cannabis. I was just researching this for a chapter in my book. During the war on drugs, the government tried to kill off monkey and dogs with cannabis. It was sort of very cruel. They gave these dogs like 600 milligrams of cannabis. Now, a puff is like 5 milligrams. That's the equivalent of like 100,000 puffs. And the dogs were very sick, but they didn't die. Neither did the monkeys. So it's literally impossible, and no one has ever overdosed on cannabis. It doesn't contribute to these overdoses that we read about every day in the paper. They are multi-drug overdoses: gabapentin, benzodiazepines, as Craig mentioned, alcohol, other sedatives, and fentanyl, which is a synthetic opiate. But cannabis does not contribute at all to these overdoses. So it absolutely has a much deeper safety profile.
Yeah, fascinating responses. And I had a question for Dr. Burns. You know, taking a little bit of a step back, we started hearing, you know, overdose side effects. When we talk about the opioid crisis, what are we talking about? What is the crisis, and what are we seeing?
Well, the crisis really stems from the availability of opioids within the community, and the fact that when you take an opioid, you develop a tolerance for it. So successive doses for the same effect have to, by nature, elevate. And we reach very high doses in patients. Subsequent that, we are involving the brainstem, as previously mentioned, suppressing the drive for respiration, and unfortunately, in far too many cases, death.
Or if I could just add that most overdoses are actually from illegal opiates, and the reason that comes about is that in sort of the drug war mentality, we have a lot of people that are arguably taking too many opiates, but instead of tapering them down, what our government did, the DEA, is put a lot of pressure on physicians to not prescribe opiates to patients, which is just unethical, because you could think that there are other better treatments, but you can't just stop someone's opiates. And there's really a climate of fear among physicians for prescribing opiates. So if you're in chronic pain or you're addicted and your legal supply of opiates disappears, you're forced to buy your drugs on the street, and the street drugs are all contaminated with fentanyl and xylocaine and a million other things. So part of it is not just the medicinal use, but the very poor treatment we have for opiate addiction and for chronic pain.
And you're 110% correct, if not 199% correct on that. And there was a big push at the physician end for us to stop writing opioids. And whether it was coming from the federal government or even from a healthcare insurance company that said, you know what, Peter, now you're limited to 7 days of medicine, period. That patient, they don't have the resource. So they're going to the street and they're buying fentanyl. And if we take a look at the data that's out there and the research that's out there, roughly 35% of people who are using opioids in an addictive manner or not in the prescribed manner, they're actually getting it from friends or on the street. They are. And the number is that high. And that's where we're running into the fentanyl problems and everything else. And you're right, we were told to do something with a viable alternative. And the patients weren't given the options or the education.
You cut out there a little bit at the end there,
That's not good.
Dr. Antel.
That's not good. Sorry.
That's okay. So we heard Dr. Burns talk about the subsequent ramp up of dosing. For the viewers that are listening, where does the standard dose start, and how quickly is that ramp up over time? What does that look like?
Well, it sort of depends on the patient, how much pain they have, how well the opiate works for them, and if they have anything else going on, like childhood trauma, depression, anxiety. The opiates make you feel so good. I'm 15 years in recovery from opiate addiction, so I tend to have a lot of unfortunate lived experience of this, but the opiates are just phenomenal at making all of your other problems go away, or at least appear to go away for 6 hours, and they come back and they're a little bit worse. But so it depends on the patient, because some people start taking them very legitimately, but then they end up dependent on them sort of psychologically, in addition to having a physical dependence. It's very complicated. So I don't think you could justify. Some people need a small dose, for a little bit of chronic pain that's not receptive to non-steroidals or whatever else you're giving them. And other people have like crippling pain from cancer or from, a failed orthopedic surgery, and they legitimately do need a big dose of opiates. So it's a little bit hard to, there's no one size fits all answer to that.
David, how I love to answer that question, because I do get it frequently, is medicine is an art and not a science. And much like Peter just said, you have to look at the individual patient. My philosophy on treating this is less is more. So we always want to start with the least amount of medication we use, no matter what the problem is. And we increase it based upon symptomatology. With obviously our goal is to keep our opioid use low dose and short term.
Yeah.
Right. A friend of mine wrote a paper. He was an addiction specialist about opiate prescribing that said, don't take off if you don't know how to land. Meaning, don't
That's
start
exactly
with
it.
opiates if you don't have like a, you don't keep reassessing people, and you just don't want them on it for life if they don't need to be. Some people need to be, but there's a lot of carelessness that goes along with the prescribing.
Unfortunately, once you get into the prescribing pattern for some physicians, it's easy to continue that each month. And the patient comes in and they tell you they're getting benefit, and it's easier to do that. Long term, the physician's not helping the patient in any way, shape, or form. And you're right. Very frequently, doctors don't know how to land the plane that they took off in. And that's where a lot of the patients ended up in my personal practice. They were with other pain management physicians who didn't know how to get them off the opioids they had them on, with the exception of recommending Suboxone or Methadone or something else. And these patients at that point, they were done with this to begin with. So they were looking for that other viable alternative. And they had nowhere to go.
Yeah, and during the conversation, I heard some of the crisis really stems from the regulatory pressure from the government. Maybe there's some pressure coming from the insurance companies. At that point is where you folks introduce cannabis and bring that to the table. And what's your experience when you say, hey, like, have you considered cannabis?
Well, that's about 8 questions at once, but just about the insurance issue, it's very difficult. I work in an inner city clinic. About half of my patients are Spanish speaking. A lot of them are immigrants from Central and South America. And, I've gotten people off benzodiazepines, and I've gotten them off, like Valium, these sedatives that are very addictive, and I've gotten them off opiates. And they come back 2 months later and they say the medical cannabis was $150 a month. Insurance doesn't pay for it. And on my Mass Health, the Percocet was $1 a month and the Valium was $1 a month. So I had to switch back, even though I felt better on the cannabis. So,
Wow.
Cannabis can't just be for wealthy people. It has to be covered by insurance, and it has to be somehow subsidized for people on fixed incomes like veterans and the elderly. So I've had success actually undermined by exactly the issue that you're raising in that question.
I've seen that as well on my end. And I'm not, I was not in an inner city hospital. I was sitting in Midtown Manhattan. So my patient demographic was slightly different, but that cost is there regardless. And if you look at the data, your medical cannabis patient on the average is going to the dispensary twice a month, and they're spending a little bit over $100 each time.
Yeah.
So they're out of pocket a little bit greater than $200. Regardless of race or ethnicity here, our highest percentage of opioid users are the elderly. They are. And they're the ones who are on the fixed income as well. So we have these two things here colliding. The insurance it'll get there eventually, insurance coverage, but it's not there today. And that makes it difficult. As we sit here, and I know David and his company are looking at this as well, we're trying to figure out how we can help these people. And unfortunately, our hands are tied with regulations and laws often. Like, we can't gift cannabis to patients. It doesn't work like that. So we're trying to work inside the regulatory framework that we have in order to provide the product. And if we take a step back, it should be simple. Because cannabis is like produce, as far as I'm concerned. And it has a shelf life, and it expires. And like anything else, it needs to move. You don't want rotting tomatoes and bananas sitting in your store. You're going to discount them and you're going to sell them. So if you're at this point in your business, in your company, or whatever it is, where you're looking at destroying product or giving it to folks that need it, take the latter of the two and do the right thing. And that's what we're pushing for. And that hopefully, Peter, will make a little bit of a difference overall and David and what we're talking about here, because the access is key.
In Canada, they give cannabis to their veterans who qualify. I mean, it can be done.
It should be done. And, you know, in New York State, for example, which is where I sit, it's covered by workers' compensation,
Wow.
but the injured worker still has to lay out their own money to get it because the system hasn't caught up.
Yeah.
So it's covered. I got that. But the guy who's out of work, who has to make the decision between feeding his family,
Right.
feeding his family.
Yeah.
So we need to catch up, you know, from a legislative perspective on this and really look at who's in need and address them as a primary target.
I think it comes to funding of research where the insurance companies or the payers say there's no large scale studies that support its efficacy. So they stay away from it. And the scheduling does not allow the NIH, the CDC, all the, you know, people that fund these large studies to contribute to them. So it's a circular thing where they hide behind the lack of research, but won't fund the research.
No, I completely agree, Phil. And there's also the fact that the insurance companies are making a fortune off the fact that people are substituting cannabis for all these other medications that they're not paying for. There was an article that came out in 2016 in Health Affairs magazine where in Colorado, when they legalized cannabis, the prescriptions for all of the indications that cannabis can treat went down across the board, and they saved hundreds of millions of dollars. And this was just at the beginning of the law, and this was just incidentally. I mean, the insurance companies are getting with robbery in this. I mean, they absolutely are just making so much money by patients using cannabis. There's no reason in the world why they shouldn't be covering some of this.
And, you know, if you look at patient feedback or in consumer feedback, the numbers are astronomical. When you compare patient satisfaction of cannabis to opioids, it's 80%.
Right.
80% of the patients prefer cannabis, and greater than 90% have less of a side effect profile than they had with the opioids. So the consumer themselves are asking for it, and the consumer is pushing this forward. And as hopefully the people in charge of policy will listen to what the consumers and the constituents are actually looking for here.
Fascinating. And so, guys, moving the conversation along, I wanted to make sure to provide our viewers almost an unbiased perspective. And so I wanted to run through what are the pros and what are the cons of cannabis versus opioids. And we can start with the pros. What are the pros of cannabis versus opioids?
Well, you can't overdose and die, which was alluded to just a few minutes ago.
Let's start there. Yeah.
No, it's also every study that you look at cites improved quality of life.
Yes.
I mean, you know, the opiates do to a certain extent take care of the pain, but you're also like sedated, itchy, constipated. It affects motor function, and cannabis just has a much more benign side effect profile. And, you know, it's really interesting, you know, the medical societies they're about 50 years behind everybody else on this issue, but they're very begrudgingly in the face of like reality and public pressure, including cannabis on their algorithm of how you treat pain, but it's always like the fourth or fifth option. But what I see is a primary care doctor is like so many patients in their 50s, 60s, and 70s are undergoing this slow death of their kidneys from using so many non-steroidals, the Aleve, the Advil, the Naprosyn, the diclofenac. And I just think a lot of this could be prevented by using small doses of mostly non-intoxicating cannabinoids. So I think the advantages are that you don't destroy your kidney like you do with non-steroidals if they don't give you a heart attack or an ulcer first. And you can get addicted with cannabis, but the addiction rates are much lower, and it's a less severe addiction for most people. Some people get into very bad trouble. So I would say like less addictive, much higher quality of life ratings, equal treatment of the pain, and the patients just do a lot better.
And absolutely. And another real big one here, and it's the last thing you said, is it's actually patient preference, David. And patients prefer it. So, and what I always say when I would teach residents or fellows, listen to the patient. They'll tell you what's wrong. Let them talk. They'll tell you what works. I don't know what works for you. Everyone's different. And they'll tell you what doesn't work. And yeah, no one is overdosing. And when we look at anti-inflammatories that people were using, and I know it was an opioid talk, you know, one Advil, we do an endoscope, we see changes. We start to see erosions. You know, the studies are out there. One Advil raises your risk of stroke and heart attack. We're not seeing any of this with cannabis. And I'm going to throw the word out here now because
Throw it out there.
heard me say it before. Homeostasis. I say it every week. It's all about the endocannabinoid system and homeostasis in the body. It's one of my favorite words with cannabis.
It's a good one. It's a good one.
Yep.
Well, another pro is that cannabis, because it works on the endocannabinoid system, which involves virtually every system in our body, cannabis does several things at once. Like if you have a patient with fibromyalgia, you can treat their anxiety, their poor appetite, their pain, their nausea, their insomnia, and their quality of life. You can treat like 5 or 6 different things. In this sense, it's really helpful, for example, with elderly patients, older Americans, to get them off the 20 medications they end up on, which is very dangerous because they have like synergistic side effects. And so it really helps people be on fewer medications because it alleviates several very common conditions at once. And, you know, people are having a hard time affording medications. People are having side effects from a lot of these medications. It can be a lot safer just to be on cannabis for many of these, not for everything. It doesn't cure everything and it doesn't work for everybody, but it really is pretty amazing how many other medications you can get people off.
And just so the viewers who are watching this are super clear about this, we're not telling you to stop your blood pressure pills here. Got it? We're not saying that.
Good disclosure.
Yeah, full disclosure, you know, speak to your physician. A lot of the medicines you're taking, you're on them for a real specific reason that cannabis might not help with. However, though, much like Dr. Grinspoon just said, Dr. Burns and I have been in practice for 30 years, and we certainly have witnessed when we put patients on cannabinoid products, their total list of medications drops.
Wow.
It does.
That's fascinating. All right. And just so our viewers know that we're looking at both sides of the leaf here, what are some of the cons of taking cannabis versus opioids?
Yeah. So, and I'm going to hop on that one super quick.
Yeah.
I always like, you know, when you go to like the amusement park, they tell you what you can't do first on the ticket. So I like to start with that. You know, the biggest con we have here right now, and Dr. Burns mentioned it before, is we're really lacking large concrete studies in this. And we're unraveling the endocannabinoid system. And it's taken us a long time to figure out part of the neurology and cardiovascular and everything else. So we're kind of just starting with this. And like Dr. Grinspoon mentioned, the endocannabinoid system affects all the other systems. So we don't have enough data that we as scientists would ultimately love to have. So that's one of the cons. A bigger con, and I think the biggest con, is education and lack thereof. And it's a lack of education on the prescriber side. It's a lack of education on the consumer side. And it's a lack of education at that point of sale in the dispensary side. And I would always write, to the best of my ability, a detailed prescription for cannabis. And the patient would take it to one of the dispensaries, and invariably they would come back and follow up, because I follow them all up, and I would say, how did it go? And the first thing is the pharmacist chuckled because I wrote something detailed instead of checking the box as per pharmacist consultation. So when we take a look at this here now, if any of these physicians on this call were to write a blood pressure prescription, we would write the product, the dose, the frequency, and how to use it. It's a medicine. That we're not seeing yet in cannabis. So I see that as a big con. And since we're trying to introduce folks to what we know is a viable alternative, and I think we're all in agreement here, a safer alternative to what they're using now, they have to have that positive experience that first time. So if someone shows up who's native to cannabis, meaning they've never had it before, and I write them a very low THC prescription because I know that's what they need, and they show up and they have carte blanche, they might walk out with a higher concentration of THC, have an adverse response, and we've lost that patient. And not only do we lose that patient, but I'm more worried about we've lost them in a rebound effect too, where they're going to double down on what they did before.
Yeah.
So when you ask about the cons, I think the biggest con we have right now is from an educational perspective.
Right. I mean, just for the sake of, being thorough, doctors don't typically recommend smoking cannabis. There are much safer ways to consume it. Edible, a suppository, a tincture under your tongue, a topical. Very concerned about teenagers using it because there's some concern, particularly before the age of 16, that it could affect brain development. And, if it's lying around, teenagers, they're sort of programmed to take every risk that they possibly can. Of course, the rates have not gone up with legalization. And we don't know if that's because it's boring if your parents are doing it, or if because, a drug dealer will sell cannabis to anybody, whereas the dispensaries actually check for ID. Its safety for pregnancy and breastfeeding have not been established at all. And there's some concern it doesn't cause schizophrenia. I go into this in detail in my book. It absolutely does not cause schizophrenia, but it can precipitate it earlier in patients who are predisposed to it. So you have to be very careful with people with a family history of psychosis. And also just like with any other drug, it's dose related. If you start low and go slow, very few people get in trouble with cannabis, but it can be very unpleasant and anxiety provoking. It could even trigger arrhythmias if you take too high a dose. Yeah. So, doctors complain that people that work in the dispensaries don't know anything, shouldn't be dispensing medical advice. Yet if you go to most doctors, they don't know anything about cannabis. So it seems like who are patients supposed to go to? And most patients, like in the recent study, 55% wanted to go to their doctors for advice, but only 2.5% actually did. It's probably about the percentage of doctors that know enough about cannabis to actually prescribe it. But they go to a dispensary and I was speaking to a bunch of addiction doctors at a dispensary recently, and they had a chocolate bar that had 1,100 milligrams in it, in one chocolate bar. Each piece, and it wasn't marked at all. Each piece was 110 milligrams. Now, again, that's like 22 puffs of modern strong cannabis. Like if I took 100 milligrams, I'd probably have a panic attack. So I think starting low and going slow. And honestly, I think all the fighting about legalization, we should be figuring out how to legalize safely rather than fighting over whether it should be legalized, because those animals are already out of the barn.
And, you hit something with legalization as well and doing it properly. And another con that we see, David, is black market cannabis is very easy to get.
And less expensive.
And if folks are going to go that route because of the tax structure or the lack of access that they're able to get through a dispensary, we don't know what they're taking at that time. And, Peter was alluding to it before, whether it's sprayed or who knows what's going on. Yeah. So that's also another con. And then that patient comes back again and they didn't get better. So it's, the education of it is huge. And also moving folks into the regulated industry is very important.
Thank you guys for those insights. And so with all that culminated together, the pros, the cons, in your professional opinion, is cannabis as safe as traditional prescription medicine, even even though we don't have the research, even though the education isn't there, but we're seeing a lot of positives with patients taking it. What's your opinion on that?
Well, can I first push back on the idea that we don't have the research? We don't have as many of a certain type of research that doctors really prefer, called randomized controlled trials, where you give one person the drug and you give the other person a sugar pill. It's very hard to do that with cannabis because it affects how you think and how you feel. So people tend to know which arm of the study they're in. But there's an abundance of other types of evidence that we use all the time in medicine called real world evidence. Patient registries, observational studies. I mean, for example, for something like chronic pain, like the jury is not still out about whether cannabis works. It absolutely works. It's just, you have to keep in mind also the social history and the context. Our government's been waging this war on drugs, and they literally, the US government funded like 85 to 90% of drug research worldwide over the last like 70 years, starting, with Nixon's war on drugs in the early 1970s. And they would not fund any studies that show benefit or any researchers that were interested in showing benefits. They would only fund harms. So the data that we have is really biased against cannabis. And there's also, this preference for this certain type of study that you can't even really do very well with cannabis. And I do think that there's plenty of evidence for many of these indications, not for all of them. I gave such a long answer to that, I forgot the other part of your question.
I'm going to add on to that. So yes, and a lot of this data we have is crowded. It's, it's from the crowd. It is. And a lot of it's real time. A lot of it's live. A lot of those apps are collecting this data. The dispensaries are collecting it. And one of the fascinating things is if you look at it and you look at why the consumer is there, they're there for these reasons. They're there to address their chronic pain. They're there to address their anxiety. They're there to address their depression, etc. So, this is a fascinating industry here where as physicians, it's actually the patient wants the medication. It's as doctors, we're usually prescribing something and we get a little bit of a pushback here and there. It's the opposite. We just need to be able to deliver it in the appropriate manner.
Yeah. I think when we talk about safety, it's also, is it safe for you, right? So you're going to your physician who you trust and knows you very well. He knows your clinical picture in terms of what other comorbidities you have, what medications you're on, etc. Right? And are you buying it from a reputable place where it is grown safely, pesticides, fertilizers, insecticides, etc. And then are you taking the right product relative to THC, CBD, terpene profile, etc. that's respectful of your diagnosis? And are you taking the right quantity? And what sort of clinical picture overall in the context of those points, would lead you to the safest and most beneficial outcome?
Right. And absolutely, it depends on the patient. Like some people need opiates. Some people need the very strong anti-inflammatory, the non-steroidals. But generally speaking, I think cannabis most people would agree, is safer than opiates. And I would suggest just as safe, if not safer, than chronic daily non-steroidal use. And again, I think it should be much farther up on our algorithm. The reason it isn't is because, a lot of these pain doctors like to give injections, so they don't love cannabis. And furthermore, it's sort of old fart syndrome. It's like really hard to teach people a whole new field when in truth, doctors' plates are overflowing. They're burning out. They're totally stressed out. And like now they're supposed to learn about a whole new neurotransmitter system and how to prescribe a plant. So there's a lot of like institutional inertia, which is preventing this. But I honestly think overdose deaths could be prevented, other morbidities, and a lot of the harms that we talked about with the non-steroidals can be, as long as you don't use it before driving, you don't use it when you're pregnant, unless under certain circumstances, you don't let your kid or your pet get into your edibles. I mean, there are ways to make it safer. It's not also a binary question, is it safe or unsafe? You can make it a lot safer, educate people not to smoke it. I think don't make it into these little gummies that a 4-year-old is going to eat the whole package of. Educate people to keep the THC doses low, as was alluded to earlier, and to incorporate other cannabinoids that protect against the CBD, protect against the THC, have people start low and go slow and have very close follow-up. And what would honestly make it a lot safer is if physicians not only were educated about it in the endocannabinoid system, but if they would drop the sort of snooty, critical, dismissive attitude, because patients are afraid to bring up their medical cannabis use with their physicians. And that's really dangerous because there are drug interactions that can be avoided if the doctor and the patient are having an open and free conversation. There are different anesthesia requirements if you use a lot of cannabis every day, but you can make it a lot safer by changing the climate in which patients feel more comfortable. And I always say to other doctors, whether you're pro, neutral, against, or couldn't care less about cannabis, you have to create a climate in which patients feel comfortable discussing it with you. Or what you're going to do is feed into this dual system of healthcare where they go to their doctor for some things and to their cannabis clinicians for other things, and the two do not connect at all. It's very dangerous. So just to answer your question, like, is it safe? The answer is like, basically it's safe for most people, and we can make it a lot safer by doing some simple common sense things.
Awesome. And switching gears here a little bit, we talked about patients coming in and being afraid to speak up about, hey, you know, is this a viable option for me? Is cannabis something that I should go into or give a try? I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the Latino beliefs and some of those taboos. And I always ask, what are you seeing? What are we seeing when people come into the office and say, hey, I'm thinking about cannabis, but I'm not exactly sure if I should dive right in? What are some of those experiences?
It really depends on who's coming into the office. And if we focus on the Latin and the Hispanic population, they're kind of distinct from other groups that come in, because what we typically have here is an intergenerational and an intercultural household. And we have taboos and beliefs that have been passed down. We spoke about the war on drugs a few minutes ago, but actually Mexico was much harsher on cannabis before the US was. And elderly folks, the elderly grandparents that are still running around here who grew up there, they would view the cannabis smokers as lazy, as criminals, and that is still there. And religion plays a huge role in this as well. You don't see this in other subsets of society. And that's very, very powerful. And what I notice in my Hispanic patient population, it's rare I just have one individual. I usually have multiple members of that household. And if I have someone on the elderly side, a big portion of that visit is spent breaking down these taboos. Luckily, there is trust in the healthcare provider there, which you do not see everywhere.
Yeah.
So as physicians, we're able to deliver that message. The youngest segment of the US population is the Hispanic segment. Just so everyone knows, average age of 29.5. Also, that younger Hispanic population has a decent sized percentage of active cannabis users. So culturally, you know, the older generation is looking at them with a side eye and a little bit of a glare, like, what are you doing here? This isn't good. And that's a lot of education. The other thing, which I noticed with the Hispanic community, is two things. First off, if we're not able to effectively communicate with that patient, we've lost them. And I'm talking language barrier, absolutely positively. And that doesn't come into play when someone books a patient, and we speak Spanish, good enough. When someone books a patient with a doctor, that doesn't come into play. Maybe they bring an interpreter or something. So you've absolutely lost the patient right there. Also, your Hispanic population will first go to a community center. That's what the data shows us. they're not going to the doctor first. They're going to their community for help and assistance. And that's where we need to direct a lot of our education. And we need to be cognizant of where this specific patient population is going and what their taboos are. And by addressing it at that level, us as providers will do a much better job.
I love that. I love that response, and can
I just say that I
can totally attest to that. Look into
I
the
just say I
community
completely
first.
agree with that. Age is huge. You know, younger patients, regardless of what their ethnicity or culture is, seem to be much more sort of uninhibited about it than older Americans, because they've spent more of their lives with two messages about cannabis as opposed to just most of their lives under the drug war nonsense. Language barrier is huge. In my health center, we all speak Spanish or have translators. But if you go to a dispensary, that's not necessarily the case.
No.
And also just answering the email from the state to get signed up as a medical patient. I would say immigration status, because there's still a stigma and it's illegal federally. So a lot of my patients who are illegal immigrants are terrified to try it. They love to try it, but they're terrified because they just can't afford to have any blemish on their federal record. And then finally, I agree that religion is a huge component. A lot of my Hispanic patients are evangelicals. You know, I'll spend months treating them for something really complicated, do a great job, and they'll be like, "The Lord cured me." I'll be like, I guess, you know, the Lord created primary care doctors, whatever. So that's a philosophical discussion. It seems like a misattribution of credit. But the fact is, like, patients won't get vaccines. They're being told in their evangelical churches that the vaccines are like the devil's mark and the devil's symbol. It's a very different culture than, you know, the kind of pro-cannabis culture. So I think all of the points that Craig made are really accurate and really important. If I were a dispensary, I would definitely have Spanish-speaking staff and advertise that. I don't know why they don't do that.
Totally agree. And that's an interesting point that we haven't heard before is, I mean, I think the latest number I saw is 13, 14 million undocumented immigrants that are Latino or Hispanic living in the US. And to your point, they can't access cannabis. They don't have a way of getting it, and they don't want that blemish on their record. It would jeopardize their opportunity for naturalization, for fixing their document or immigration status. And so that's an interesting point that you bring up, and absolutely. And
right. And one more point is drug testing. A lot of employers still do pre-employment drug testing, and cannabis stays in your urine for like 2 to 3 weeks. So like if I used it 3 weeks ago, I might have a positive urine test today. But in reality, if I used it 3 weeks ago, I'm obviously not impaired today. It's completely nonsensical that they use drug testing for employment. People are moving away from that, but I think a lot of patients get derailed. And then a lot of other silly things like, you know, I'm not a gun person at all, but you can't have a cannabis license and a gun license in Massachusetts.
Or New York.
You drink as much alcohol as you want, which makes you belligerent and angry, but you're not allowed to use cannabis, which makes you sit in the sofa and joke with your friends. So there are a lot of very more subtle and arbitrary institutional barriers to cannabis that come out when you're in the field trying to prescribe it.
Awesome, very insightful. And gentlemen, bringing it back to our topic of discussion for today, how does cannabis help alleviate the opioid crisis?
Well, I have a pretty pat answer to that because I talk about this a lot. There are 5 ways, 4 of which I support. The first is you start new patients who want to be with chronic pain on cannabis instead of opiates. So they're
Absolutely
floating
yes.
around. Number 2, you offer patients who have been on chronic opiates to transition off. Now, this has to be voluntary. If you mandatorily yank away their opiates, there are suicides and they just get their drugs in the street. It has to be voluntary, but you offer that. That's number 2. Number 3 is you could use much lower doses of, as we mentioned before, of opiates if you co-use cannabis at the same time. The 4th one is that it's extremely helpful for withdrawal symptoms. I've lived experience with this, and this is also proven by the data. It is much more effective than any of the stuff we prescribe for opiate withdrawal. It's like phenomenally effective, which virtually anybody who's ever recovered from opiate addiction will be the first to tell you. The 5th way, which some people support, but I'm not quite there yet, is can we use cannabis as a medication for opiate use disorder like Suboxone or methadone? Can we use it as replacement therapy. I've spoken to hundreds, if not thousands, of patients that have used cannabis to get off opiates and to get into recovery. And I think for a lot of people, cannabis does play an important part in the recovery. And I'm totally against the really strict, harsh abstinence only model of AA, which is 100 years outdated. But at the same time, there's evidence that methadone and buprenorphine, Suboxone and methadone, have a 50 to 80% drop in overdoses and deaths. And given that we just don't have that evidence yet with cannabis, I don't feel comfortable using it as a replacement. I'll probably put them on Suboxone and say use cannabis for withdrawal symptoms.
Very insightful and very well organized. I mean, those are very strong ways that cannabis is helping to alleviate the opioid crisis. Thank you for sharing that. All right, gentlemen.
All right.
What else we got? Do we have any other questions we want to get in here? I think this has been a great discussion, by the way.
Yeah, this was a fun one. Thank you, Peter.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it was great. Thank you, guys.
This is how we always are.
I mean, the question is how to fix these things.
Yeah.
More translators or Spanish-speaking staff at dispensaries, hammer away at the health insurance, educate doctors is number 1, 2, and 3. It's completely not helpful that people can't get helpful information from their doctors. That's what a lot of what my book is about. Hammer away at the stigma, work with older patients to help them feel more comfortable with it. But the tide is really turning. I just want to say that 94% of Americans support legal access to medical cannabis. Now, name anything that 94% of Americans agree on. They literally don't agree that the sky is blue about anything.
Right.
Who would have guessed 20 years ago? I've been involved with this my whole life because my dad was a huge leader in the legalization movement, but who would have guessed like 20, 30 years ago that cannabis would be legal access to medical cannabis would be the thing that most Americans agree upon?
I would have never thought it. And it's, for me, it really motivated me to leave my practice. I was director of ortho rehab. I sat in a very comfortable chair, and I could have sat in that chair for the next 20 years and sailed off into the sunset. However, I got such satisfaction out of giving people back their lives and working on their opioid issues and moving them over to a non-sedating, non-euphoric cannabis product. And they would come in, and you've seen this, and they're like, thank you. They're like, thank you. And
Not only are they like that, they're skeptical doctors who sent them to you after getting bludgeoned and nagged by the patients. Thank you as well, which is really astounding.
Yeah. Well, the doctors dump them on us. Maybe the cannabis guy can help you. And, and we end up helping them. And people have, they're working full time. They're not scouring the street. And you said something very important, Peter. If we treat the patient with the right product day one, whatever it is, we're better off down the road. And, for a while, doctors were prescribing these opioids for these minor orthopedic issues and everything else because we were told it was safe. A little bit before me, but it was safe. It was non-addictive. And you said something very important before. When's this doctor learning the endocannabinoid system? Here's the reality, folks. They're not.
Yeah.
Your doctor is working from 8 in the morning till 8 at night, putting out fires, going home. He or she has to learn what they need to learn in their practice, let alone a whole nother system. So that's difficult, and that harms the patients because, you dove right into the deep end of the pool. But as well as I do that original available education that we got was not good enough. And a lot of folks stop at that. And, much like there's pill mills out there, there's cannabis doctors that don't care, and they just write a prescription and off they go. So as physicians and as an organization, we need to do better. And another thing that would really help us, since we spoke pharmaceuticals versus cannabis, and I'm throwing this at you, David, we need more collaboration and organization as an industry. And we need to speak as an industry voice And we're not there yet because everyone's still trying to figure out where they are in the industry. Pharmaceutical industry speaks as one voice. They do. And they're able to get stuff accomplished. We can do the same thing to a greater degree because what we have that the pharmaceutical industry does not have is the public support.
Yeah.
The public's behind us. So we have the tailwind, we have everything. We just need to be together as a group.
Well, and we need the medical associations to leave the Middle Ages and enter the 21st century. You know,
The medical
the American
association-
Medical Association still puts quotation marks around medical marijuana when they talk about it.
They're tough, and you know as well as I do that there's a older generation of physicians that need to retire out like there are in every other industry. So the younger folks who are a little more objective and not set in their ways, you know, as doctors, we learn something, and that's what we do. We follow it. You know, we use a certain medicine, we're comfortable with it, we move forward. We don't like variability, we like science. So that'll all come along over time. These medical societies will certainly wake up to this a little bit.
I mean, it's interesting because like 68% of physicians in a recent survey think marijuana is a perfectly legitimate medicine. But if you look at the medical societies that supposedly represent them, they're completely against it. There's such a disconnect.
There's a major disconnect, and it's what I said before with, you know, folks not listening to what other people want. And it's, but they're all going to turn around. It's as the research continues, because we know what's going on, and as the data continues to accumulate, you can only ignore something for so long.
Amen to that.
And also a bigger part of the pushback here is as long as it's a Scheduled I drug and certain bigger players can't step into this industry, they're going to, you know, try to knock it down. And we know, you know, pharma can't get into it really yet. A lot of folks can't. But
Well,
if it
we talk a lot
deschedules,
about-
becomes more widely available, I think a lot of those thought processes will change.
Right, that's a really good point. Cannabis is still scheduled under Schedule I, which is drugs which have quote unquote high abuse liability and no medical potential, neither, which could be further for the truth for cannabis. And it makes it much more legal in the places where it's not legal. It makes it harder to reconcile state and federal policies, and it makes it almost impossible to do research. Whereas other countries in Europe, Canada, Israel, they're so far ahead of us, both in educating their physicians and in the research that they're able to do. So we really need to, and almost everybody agrees with taking it out of Schedule I. It's just this institutional inertia in the government. It's really bizarre.
Totally. Well, hey guys, I think that's going to wrap it up for today's discussion. I wanted to personally thank you for joining us, Dr. Craig Untitled, Dr. Phil Burns, Dr. Peter Grinspoon. You guys have been a phenomenal panel. And thank you to our viewers for joining us today with the NHCC and the Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. Today's Cannabis 101 session was very informative on cannabis, opioids, and the opioid crisis. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
All right, nice to meet you guys.
Pleasure.
Pleasure, guys.
Great work.
Have
We
a
look
good,
forward to seeing you again, Peter.
Absolutely. You guys take care.
have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
See you guys.
Bye.